The President's press conference from the State Department Auditorium in Washington, D.C., October 9th, 1963.
I have a statement to make. The Soviet Union and various Eastern European countries have expressed a willingness to buy from our private grain dealers at the regular world price several million tons of surplus American wheat or wheat flour for shipment during the next several months. They may also wish to purchase from us surplus feed grains and other agricultural commodities. After consultation with the National Security Council and informing the appropriate leaders of the Congress, I have concluded that such sales by private dealers for American dollars or gold, either cash on delivery or normal commercial terms, should not be prohibited by the government. The Commodity Credit Corporation in the Department of Agriculture will sell to our private grain traders the amount necessary to replace the grain used to fulfill these requirements, and the Department of Commerce will grant export licenses for their sale, with a commitment that these commodities are for delivery to and use in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe only. An added feature is the provision that the wheat we sell to the Soviet Union will be carried in available American ships, supplemented by ships of other countries as required. Arrangements will also be made by the Department of Commerce to prevent any single American dealer from receiving an excessive share of these sales. No action by the Congress is required, but a special report on the matter will be sent to both houses tomorrow. Basically, the Soviet Union will be treated like any other cash customer in the world market who is willing and able to strike a bargain with private American merchants. While this wheat, like all wheat sold abroad, will be sold at the world price, which is the only way it can be sold, there is in such transactions no subsidy to the foreign purchaser, only a savings to the American taxpayer on wheat the government has already purchased and stored at the higher domestic price, which is maintained to assist our farmers. This transaction has obvious benefits for the United States. The sale of 4 million metric tons of wheat, for example, for an estimated $250 million, and additional sums from the use of American shipping will benefit our balance of payments and gold reserves by that amount and substantially strengthen the economic outlook for those employed in producing, transporting, handling, and loading farm products. Wheat, moreover, is our #1 farm surplus today, to the extent of about 1 billion unsold bushels. The sale of around 150 million bushels of wheat would be worth over $200 million to the American taxpayer in reduced budget expenditures. Our country has always responded to requests for food from governments of people who needed it, so long as we were certain that the people would actually get it and know where it came from. The Russian people will know they are receiving American wheat. The United States has never had a policy against selling consumer goods, including agricultural commodities, to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. On the contrary, we have been doing exactly that for a number of years. And to the extent that their limited supplies of gold, dollars, and foreign exchange must be used for food, they cannot be used to purchase military or other equipment. Our allies have long been engaged in extensive sales of wheat and other farm products to the communist bloc, and in fact it would be foolish to halt the sales of our wheat when other countries can buy wheat from us today and then sell it as flour to the communists. In recent weeks, Australia and NATO allies have agreed to sell 10 to 15 million tons of wheat and wheat flour to the communist bloc. This transaction advertises to the world as nothing else could the success of free American agriculture. It demonstrates our willingness to relieve food shortages, to reduce tensions, and to improve relations with all countries. And it shows that peaceful agreements with the United States, which serves the interests of both sides, are a far more worthwhile course than a course of isolation and hostility. For this government to tell our grain traders that they cannot accept these offers, on the other hand, would accomplish little or nothing. The Soviets would continue to buy wheat and flour elsewhere, including wheat flour from those nations which buy our wheat. Moreover, having for many years sold them farm products which are not in surplus, it would make no sense to refuse to sell those products on which we must otherwise pay the cost of storage. In short, this particular decision with respect to sales to the Soviet Union, which is not inconsistent with many smaller transactions over a long period of time, does not represent a new Soviet-American trade policy. That must await the settlement of many matters. But it does represent one more hopeful sign that a more peaceful world is both possible and beneficial to us all.
Mr. President, do you have any misgivings about possible political repercussions from your decision?
Well, I suppose there'll be some who disagree with this decision. That's true about most decisions. But I've considered it very carefully. I think it's very much in the interest of the United States. As I said before, we've got 1 billion bushels of this in surplus, and American taxpayers are paying to keep it. And I think we can use the $250 million of gold, which will help our balance of payments. I think it's in our interest, particularly in view of the fact of the sales that are being made by other countries.
Mr. President,
Yeah.
Could you discuss some of the recent public accounts of CIA activities in South Vietnam, particularly the stories of or reports of how the CIA has undertaken certain independent operations? They're independent of other elements of the American government that are in South Vietnam.
I must say I think the reports are wholly untrue. The fact of the matter is that Mr. McCone sits in the National Security Council. I imagine I see him at least 3 or 4 times a week, ordinarily. We have worked very closely together in the National Security Council in the last 2 months, attempting to meet the problems we faced in South Vietnam. I can find nothing, and I've looked through the record very carefully over the last 9 months, and I could go back further to indicate that the CIA has done anything but support policy. It does not create policy. It attempts to execute it in those areas where it has competence and responsibility. I know that the transfer of Mr. John Richardson, who's a very dedicated public servant, has led to surmises, but I can just assure you flatly that the CIA has not carried out independent activities, but has operated under close control of the Director of Central Intelligence, operating under with the cooperation of the National Security Council and under my instructions. So I think that while the CIA may have made mistakes, as we all do on different occasions, and has had many successes, which may go unheralded, in my opinion in this case, it's unfair to charge them as they have been charged. I think they've done a good job.
Mr. President, you're meeting tomorrow with Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko under somewhat different conditions than you met a year ago. I'm wondering if you would care to give us your assessment of the principal objective of your talk tomorrow with him.
Well, this continues to be an exchange of views on those matters which are at issue between the Soviet Union and the United States. In my speech before the General Assembly, I indicated those areas where the Soviet Union and the United States had disagreement. It's my hope that those disagreements will not lead to war. I'm hopeful that what's happened in the last months will lessen that prospect. Really, what's happened since a year ago when I saw Mr. Gromyko will lessen the prospect of a military clash. But the differences go on. The systems are very different. Mr. Khrushchev has said that there's no coexistence in the field of ideology. It's bound to be very severe matters which concern us, and which the Soviet Union and the United States have very different views, as we don't want these disputes and frictions to escalate into military clashes. It's worthwhile to have consultations. The Secretary of State's been having them for several weeks, and I will see Mr. Gromyko this afternoon to just go over the ground which has already been laid by the Secretary of State.
Mr. President,
Yes,
will you discuss with Mr. Gromyko the joint moon project that you made, the proposal you made before the UN?
Yes,
and if not, will that be pursued through some other channel?
We have received no response to that proposal, which would follow other proposals made on other occasions. As I said, our space program from the beginning has been oriented towards peaceful use of space. That's the way the National Space Agency was set up. That's the position we've taken since my predecessor's administration. I said this summer that we were anxious to cooperate in the peaceful exploration of space, but to do so, of course, requires the breakdown of a good many barriers which still exist. It's our hope those barriers, which represent barriers of some hostility, some suspicion, secrecy, and the rest will come down. If they came down, of course, it would be possible for us to cooperate. So far, as you know, the cooperation has been limited to some exchange of information on weather and other rather technical areas. We've had no indication, in short, that the Soviet Union is disposed to enter into the kind of relationship which would make a joint exploration of space or to the moon possible. But I think it's important that the United States continue to emphasize its peaceful interests and its preparation to go quite far in attempting to end the barrier which has existed between the communist world and the West, and to attempt to bring as much as we can the communist world into the free world of diversity which we seek. So the matter may come up, but I must say we've had no response which would indicate that they are going to take us up on it.
Mr. President, in the reported agreement in principle between Russia and the United States to ban nuclear weapons from outer space, has the issue of verification come up in any way, and if so, sir, in what way?
No, there isn't an agreement. The United States has stated it would not put weapons in outer space. We have no military use for doing so, and we would not do so. The Soviet Union has stated that it does not intend to. We're glad of that. There's no way we can verify that, but we're glad to hear the intention. We must recognize that there is no secure method of determining that someday they may not decide to do so, so we obviously have to take our own precautions. We don't intend to, though we intend to protect our security. We're glad to hear that the Soviet Union does not intend to. This is a matter, it seems to me, that can be best handled not through any bilateral agreement, but as a General Assembly matter, because other countries may someday have the same capability, and I think every country should declare that they are not going to put atomic weapons in the atmosphere, which could threaten not only the security of a potential adversary, but our own security if for some reason the weapon should miscalculate and descend on us. I think it's a good idea to keep them out of the atmosphere.
Mr. President, last week in California you said something that led some people to believe you changed your opposition to a shorter work week. Is that correct?
No, I'm still opposed to it. What I was talking about was that inevitably as the century goes on, in my judgment, as machines increasingly take the place of men, that we will have more leisure, and therefore we should take those steps in the field of conservation, resource development, recreation, which will prepare us for that period. But that's not talking about today or tomorrow. It would be a great mistake for us to reduce our 40-hour work week now. It would affect our competitive position abroad. I think the needs of American production are such that we ought to stick with our 40-hour week. I see the time coming, as I was saying, at the end of the century, perhaps sooner than that, when there may be a change in that. Not now.
Yes. Could you say, sir, how our policy is progressing in Vietnam in meeting what you established as desirable last month, a change of personnel and a change of policy that would help the government there better get on with the war?
I don't think there have been significant changes of the kind that I say. I don't think there have been changes in the situation in the last month. I think we're still dealing with the same problems we were dealing with a month ago.
Mr. President, was Assistant Secretary Martin's statement cleared with you? And if so, does it represent a reversal of your policy on dictatorships in Latin America?
No, I was informed generally of what Mr. Martin was saying, and in fact, I reread it this afternoon. In the first place, our policy is not reversed. If attention could be drawn to Secretary Rusk's statement of Friday evening in regard to the coups in the Dominican Republic and Honduras, we made it very clear that we are opposed to an interruption of the constitutional system by a military coup. Not only because we're all committed under the Alliance for Progress to democratic government and progress and progressive government, but also because, of course, dictatorships are the seedbeds from which communism ultimately springs up. So we're opposed to military coups, and it's for that reason that we've broken off our relations with the Dominican Republic and Honduras. It's for that reason that we attempted to work on the situation in Peru, which led, I think, in part because of the American effort, mostly because of the Peruvian people's effort, to free elections. Mr. Martin was merely attempting to explain some of the problems in Latin America, why coups take place, and what problems they present us with. But we are opposed to coups because we think they are defeating. Self-defeating, defeating for the hemisphere. And we're using our influence and I'm sure the other countries of the hemisphere are using their influence in those areas where coups have taken place to provide for an orderly restoration of constitutional processes.
Mr. President, beyond the immediate action, sir, in relation to the Dominican Republic and Honduras, does the United States plan any general enunciation of policy in regard to military regimes, or does it contemplate asking any general hemispheric action in regard to this?
Well, I've just attempted to describe what our policy is towards coups. And as far as our national policy, it was described on Friday with the withdrawal of our diplomatic, with our ambassadors, our aid, military assistance, and all the rest. So I think we've made very clear our policy and our interest in providing for a return to, as I've said, constitutional processes in those two countries. We are working with the other members of the Organization of American States so that together we can bring about a return to order in those countries and a return to peaceful procedures. That's the policy of the United States. I've just enunciated it again.
I was asking specifically, sir, whether the United States contemplated any broader hemispheric action in terms of general action by the OAS in this respect.
Well, not at this time. This is a matter which I think all the other countries of the OAS have to decide what they're going to do. I think the United States has made its position very clear. Yeah.
Are you satisfied in retrospect that the United States did all it could, short of the use of force, to prevent the Dominican and Honduran coups?
Yes, I think that, yes, I am. I've looked over the conversations of the minutes of the cables and so on, and I think we did. This idea that we ought to send the United States Marines into Honduras, which of course we couldn't have done under the conditions because of the time gap, I think is a very serious mistake. That's not the way, in my opinion, and I think that Mr. Martin was attempting to explain that. That's not the way for democracy to flourish. So I think we did the best we could. Maybe possible to always do better. But we did the best we could, and we're going to continue to do so. Yeah.
There's a widespread impression that you expect Senator Barry Goldwater to be the Republican nominee for president next year. I think your speech in Salt Lake City had something to do with that. Is that your expectation?
I think he can do it. I think it's possible for him to do it. But he's got a long road to go, as recalling the situation in September 1959, October 1959. I think Senator Goldwater has a trying 7 or 8 months, which will test his endurance and his perseverance and his agility.
Basing it on your own experience?
Yes.
Former President Eisenhower wrote recently in an article that he was unclear about Senator Goldwater's views on certain major issues. I wonder, sir, whether you share this uncertainty, and if so, how you think Senator Goldwater should better express himself.
Oh, Senator Goldwater is speaking frequently, and he's saying what he thinks as of the time he speaks, and I think therefore we have an opportunity to make a judgment of where he stands. I don't think Senator Goldwater has ever been deceptive. I think he's made it very clear what he's opposed to, what he's for. I gather I've gotten the idea, and I think that President Eisenhower will as time goes on.
Mr. President, to keep the ball rolling, there are a couple of obvious candidates in another party who say they're going to make their announcement of their decisions in December or January. Have you set a timetable for yourself, or are you already a candidate?
No, I think I'll wait. This next year I can wait longer. Mr.
President, the Valachi Crime Committee hearings are getting very mixed reviews. As a former congressional investigator, I wonder whether you feel they're serving any useful purpose.
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't want to. I haven't commented on the Senate procedures, and I wouldn't now on this hearing or other hearings. That's a judgment for Senator McClellan and the committee. I do think that we shouldn't get a distorted idea from the hearings. I think that particularly as Columbus Day comes up, I think there may be some feeling of some people that the name Valachi perhaps causes embarrassment to other American citizens. I don't think it should. These difficulties occur in a good many different racial groups, and I think that they ought to feel a good deal of pride in what they've done and not to be concerned because a Valachi or Irish name or some other name may occasionally get in trouble.
President,
Yes, Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President, Congressman Kuczynski of Illinois has said to me, and I think he's proposed to Secretary of Works, that we should have 3 categories instead of 2 in our labor statistics, general statistics. He's proposing that we have employed, unemployed, and unemployables because of their lack of skills. Would you agree with the Congressman that this would be helpful in highlighting the problem we have in employment and education?
I wouldn't want to put it in that kind of a category. I think I can see there might be some merit in trying to mark out those who are unemployed because of structural unemployment, those who are unemployed because of the seasonal nature of their work, those who are unemployed because of illiteracy or lack of motivation. I think all that information, we have a good deal of it, a good deal of technical information. I don't think I would label anybody in the United States unemployable.
Mr. President, how do you feel about Senator Gruning's proposal to set up a congressional committee as a watchdog over the CIA?
I think the present committee, there's one in both the House and Senate, which maintains very close liaison with the CIA, is best considering the sensitive nature of the Central Intelligence Agency's work. As you know, there is a congressional committee in the House, one in the Senate, composed of members of the Appropriations Committee and the Armed Services Committee. They meet frequently with Mr. McCone. He also testifies before the Foreign Relations Committee of the House and Senate and the General Armed Services Committee, and I think the Congress has, through that organization, the means of keeping a liaison with them. In addition, I have an advisory council which was headed by Dr. Killian, formerly now Mr. Clark Clifford, includes Jimmy Doolittle and others, Robert Murphy, who also serve as an advisory committee to me on the work of the intelligence community. I'm well satisfied with the present arrangement. Yes.
Sir, there seems to be some connection between the attempt of the State Department to discharge Mr. Otto Otepka, the security officer. There seems to be some connection between the fact that he gave much information to the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee about various employees of the State Department, William Arthur Whelan, Walter Rostow, and many others. Also, Secretary Rusk has now put forth an order that employees of the State Department cannot talk or give information to this congressional committee. Isn't that a direct violation of law? That
no, it isn't.
Government employees are allowed to give information to members of Congress and to the committees.
By what means? You mean secret dispatches?
Well, any information. The law doesn't say what it'll be. It says that any government employee can give information to members of Congress or to the committees.
Well, let me just say that the Secretary of State has been prepared to testify since August before the Internal Security Committee and discuss the case very completely. There was a hearing scheduled for early September because of the Labor Day weekend. That hearing did not take place. The Secretary of State stands ready. He is the responsible officer. Now, the best thing to do is to give the Secretary of State a chance to explain the entire case, because in all frankness, your analysis of it is not complete.
Would you like to complete it, sir?
Well, I'd be glad to have the Secretary of State talk to the Internal Securities Committee about what it is that has caused action to be taken, administrative action within the Department of State to be taken against the gentleman that you've named, the kind of actions he's carried out, what the law said, how he met the law, how he didn't meet the law. This is all a matter which is going to be heard by the State Department Board. Then it will be heard by the Civil Service Commission for review. Then can be discussed in the courts. In the meanwhile, the Senate subcommittee can have all the information that it requires as to why Secretary Rusk has taken the action that he has. I think that's the best procedure. And I can assure you that I will examine the matter myself when it comes time, as the Secretary of State will, who bears the responsibility, when it comes time to take any disciplinary action, if such a time does come.
Mr. President, last spring there were selective price increases in steel. Recently there have been price increases in steel. Are you concerned about these increases, sir, and do you feel you're going to take any action about them?
Well, we are watching very carefully the rises which have taken place in certain industries. This country's avoided an inflationary spiral. We see no reason why there should be one now. The wholesale price index has remained relatively constant for 5 years. We are concerned that price increases in one or two basic areas may stimulate other price increases which will affect adversely our competitive position abroad, therefore affect our balance of payments, therefore affect our national interest. In addition, profits are at a record high now. They've never been higher in history, and the whole year of 1963 looks very good, and therefore we should be concerned also with reducing prices as well as increasing them. For the time being, we are watching the matter with concern, and we'll continue in the days ahead to do so.
President,
yes.
Has there been an official ruling that giving commercial credits to Russia would not violate the Johnson Act?
Yes, that's correct, because it's not a government-to-government transaction.
It's not a government-to-government
It's not a government. These are private traders that will be involved, and the credit will be granted by banks. In the case of Canada, as you know, the terms were 25% down, 25% then for every 6 months for a period of 18 months. But because the interest rate was of a certain figure, I think it was 4 7/8%, the Soviets decided to pay cash, and therefore paid something like 80% cash. We will be dealing on the same matter with them on interest rates. Our interest rates would be slightly higher than the Canadian rate, possibly, under the private commercial system, and it may be that they will decide, therefore, to pay a very large percentage in cash. But I have gotten a ruling from the Department of Justice that this does not contravene existing laws, particularly the Johnson Act.
The grain dealers take the risk then?
The grain dealers will take the risk with the private banks.
Former head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, says in an interview in the Journal American today that reports of disputes between the CIA and the State Department and various branches of the government in South Vietnam have arisen because, quote, of a lack of a clear-cut operational policy in Washington. And he goes on to say that he thinks what's needed is less backbiting between U.S. agency officials. In view of the defense you just gave of CIA, would you care to agree with Dulles' charge or contest it?
I'd agree with the last part of it, that the agencies, as we all know, we're faced with a very difficult problem in South Vietnam, which we're all familiar with, both on the military and the political side. Men have different views about what actions we should take, and they talk to members of the press, to all of you, in Saigon, here in Washington. But I must say that as of today, and I think this is particularly true since General Taylor and Secretary McNamara came back, I know of no disagreement between the State Department at the top, CIA at the top, Defense at the top, White House, and Ambassador Lodge on what our basic policies will be and what steps we will take to implement it. Now, if down below there's disagreement, I think in part it will be because they're not wholly informed of what actions we're taking. Some of them are necessarily confidential, but I think our policy, though we can't say what effect it's going to have, I think we are in agreement about what we ought to do. I would think that Saigon and personnel in the various agencies should support that policy, because that's the policy we're going to carry out for a while. Yes, John.
If I understood you correctly on the wheat statement, you said the Russian people will know they're receiving American wheat.
That's correct.
Is that by some agreement with the Soviet
No.
Union, or how would that?
No, but we have our own means of informing the Soviet Union. As you know, for many months, the Voice of America has not been blocked, for example, and therefore we believe that we have adequate means to inform the Russian people of the arrangement. In addition, I'm not sure that there's any reason for the Russians themselves to keep it quiet, as it is a commercial transaction. But in any case, we have the means to provide that knowledge. Yes, Mr. Wicker.
As the election year approaches, there's an unusual amount of political activity already, as the questions reflect. I wonder if you would give us your thinking as an experienced politician as to the prime assets of your administration next year and the prime liabilities of your administration.
I think that you wouldn't want to, as we only have a relatively short time, I think that I think we ought to make a judgment on that in '64, and I say that without any. A lot of these matters, we'll have to decide whether the United States is better off economically than it was before, and whether our position in the world has improved, and whether our prospects for peace are greater, and whether our defenses are stronger, and whether we're making progress at home and abroad. That's a matter which seems to me will be argued very strongly in '64. For example, we can't make a judgment about the state of the economy in '64. I think if they pass our tax bill, we're going to be able to demonstrate a very successful bullion economy for a period of 4 years. If they do not, we'll have a different situation. I cannot tell what our relations will be in Southeast Asia a year from now. I know what our policy, what results our policy is attempting to bring, but I think that result ought to be judged in the summer of '64 and the fall of '64, and I have hopes that the judgment will be that the economy is moving ahead, that the rate of growth has been almost $100 billion, will have been, from about $500 billion to $600 billion, that we are substantially stronger militarily, that the chances of war have been reduced, over Berlin and perhaps in other areas. But I wouldn't want to make those judgments now because I think we've still got a long way to go before next summer. And I think to say that this is the end of the road would be a mistake. I think we ought to be judged by what we do over a 4-year period, and that's the way it's going to be.
Well,
it's too early now.
Could I ask one final thing, sir? If you brought back any dominant impressions from your 2 recent trips to the West and the South, political impressions,
I'd say we're going to have a hard, close fight in 1964, but that's been my impression for a good many months.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
The President's Press Conference from the State Department Auditorium, October 31st, 1963.
Afternoon.
President, I wondered, could you tell us something about this government's policy toward reports we hear from Europe and from here about removal of American forces from Europe or reduction in the size or the strength of American personnel in Europe?
Yes, I think that Secretary Rusk explained quite clearly the American policy last weekend as he reaffirmed it. The policy of the United States is to maintain 6 divisions in Germany as long as they are required. In addition to these 6 divisions, and over and above our NATO commitments, we sent to Germany as temporary reinforcements during the Berlin crisis of 1961 6 combat units consisting of 3 artillery battalions, 2 armored battalions, and 1 armored cavalry regiment. This augmentation of U.S. forces in Germany was made to help meet the deficiency of other NATO members in fulfilling their commitments at a very crucial time when the buildup of West Germany's own forces was incomplete. Although some of these deficiencies have been corrected and the German force buildup is progressing, we are prepared to keep these additional combat units in Germany as long as there is a need for them. Thus, we are not planning any reduction in United States combat units in Germany. As part of the reorganization of the Army's European logistic forces, we are planning some reduction in non-combat personnel, a matter on which, of course, we are in touch with our allies. But we do not intend to bring back any units or personnel whose return would impair the military effectiveness of our forces in Germany. In short, we intend to keep our combat forces in Germany as they are today. And that is more than 6 combat divisions.
Mr. President, that being so, how many human beings are we going to bring back from our European station now?
Well, any we bring back, we may include some supply forces or...
As much as a regiment, sir?
Well, we've got over, I think, 240 or 50,000, so a regiment is a very small, less than 1% of that, so I'm sure that there'll be movements in and out, but we'll be talking about the whole European theater. But in the case of Germany, and I think it's important we make this clear, the 6 divisions, which are our NATO commitment, are being kept. In addition, these other combat units are being kept in Germany also. If there is any change in personnel, and I'm sure there will be some, it will be in logistic forces. There have been some changes, for example, in our logistic supply lines in France. There may be some changes in headquarter units and all the rest. They're relatively small. They may be spaced over a period of time. But our combat effectiveness, of course, is increasing as our materiel increases.
Will these 6 divisions, sir, be kept at conventional divisional strength?
That's correct. Be no change in the number of combat forces in Germany, no change in the number of these extra forces, which, as I have said, are beyond our NATO commitment, but which will also be kept in Germany.
Mr. President, you spoke of some deficiencies. Who's falling short?
We're talking about the deficiencies in 1961 when we were having a serious crisis in Berlin and where the forces, the NATO forces, were inadequate. And as you know, I think the Secretary of State made a reference to the fact that a number of our allies had not, and in some cases have not, met their NATO commitments today for the number of forces that should be stationed in Germany for the defense of Germany.
We still have to keep these troops there, though, apparently, because there
has been a build-up. There has been a build-up since 1961, particularly among the German forces, whose target is 12 divisions. Some other countries have not met their quota, but we're keeping our forces there primarily because we believe that it emphasizes the commitment of the United States to the defense of the Federal Republic and our concern about the defense of Europe. In addition, it should be pointed out that the Federal Republic, West Germany, is purchasing military equipment in the United States, which provides an offset to our gold losses for our forces in the Federal Republic. So they're making an effort, and so are we, and we're going to continue to do it.
Mr. President, Senator Goldwater accused your administration today of falsification of the news in order to perpetuate itself in office. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, what was he referring to?
Making a speech here at the Women's National Press Club, and his point was that you and your administration are mismanaging the news and using it to perpetuate yourself in office.
Well, as I've said before, I think it would be unwise at this time to answer or reply to Senator Goldwater. I'm confident that he'll be making many charges, even more serious than this one, in the coming months. And in addition, he himself has had a busy week selling TVA and giving permission to suggesting that military commanders overseas be permitted to use nuclear weapons, attacking the president of Bolivia while he was here in the United States, involving himself in the Greek election. So I thought that it really would be not fair for me this week to reply to him.
Mr. President, back to the question of troop reductions. Are any intended in the Far East at the present time, particularly in Korea, and is there any speed up in the withdrawal from Vietnam intended?
Well, as you know, when Secretary McNamara and General Taylor came back, they announced that we would expect to withdraw 1,000 men from South Vietnam before the end of the year. And there's been some reference to that by General Hawkins. If we were able to do that, that will be our schedule. I think the first unit, the first contingent, would be 250 men who are not involved in what might be called frontline operations. It would be our hope to lessen the number of Americans there by 1,000 as the training intensifies and is carried on in South Vietnam. As far as other units, we will have to make our judgment based on what the military correlation of forces may be. We are becoming increasingly mobile, as the big lift operation suggests. What is important in the case that Mr. Smith was talking about, we not only have these divisions that I described there, but we have, after the 61 experience, we moved equipment for 2 more divisions. So during the big lift, we actually have 7 divisions, so that we're able to move around the world much faster, and with new planes which are beginning to come off the production line, particularly ones in Marietta, Georgia, out of Lockheed and so on, we're going to have increased airlift capacity over the next 2 or 3 years, so naturally our force will be more mobile.
President, on the basis of your experience in Philadelphia yesterday and last night, will you regard next Tuesday's mayoral election as a test of how civil rights will affect the voting?
In Philadelphia or just?
Philadelphia, yes, as well as in other large northern cities.
Well, I'm sure that may be a factor in the election, though I'm not sure that the 2 candidates have taken different positions, but I suppose this is a matter of major concern in the country today, and it may be reflected in the voting. I'm not, as I say, aware, though it may be that the candidates have taken different positions on it. My guess would be that they've taken relatively the same position on the question.
Well, the question is whether or not there will be some backlash from white minority voters against the Democrats because of their pushing of civil rights.
Well, it's possible. We'll have to wait and see, though, as I said from the beginning, it seemed to me both parties have taken a clear position historically and at present on civil rights. But there may be. We'll have to wait and see Tuesday, and I'm sure that a good many things will be written into it.
President, United Nations Secretary General U Thant has withdrawn the mission from Yemen, which was supposed to secure peace, and the withdrawal of Nasser troops from Yemen. Since you were sponsoring this effort, could you tell us what further steps you have in mind?
Well, he is keeping his political people there, and we're still hopeful that the governments of the Saudi Arabia and the UAR will come to some conclusion either bilaterally or with the Secretary General, which will permit the ceasefire to be maintained and the withdrawal, which has been limited, to be expanded. So I haven't given up on the hope of keeping that ceasefire through November.
Is not thinking of any bilateral moves to...
No, we've expressed our great interest in seeing that fighting does not break out along the border. And I think it would be unfortunate if it did. We've indicated that to the countries involved. I'm hopeful, as I say, that perhaps they'll be able to work it out bilaterally.
Mr. President?
At least to keep the ceasefire. Yes.
Do you think the letters that Secretary of the Navy Korth wrote made his resignation advisable, and was it requested?
I think the letters which Mr. Korth and I exchanged, I think explain the situation as I would like to see it explained.
Mr. President.
Mr. Korth, I think, worked hard for the Navy, and he indicated his desire to return to private life, and I accepted that decision. But I think he worked hard for the Navy. Yes.
Mr. President, thousands of jobs are lost every week to automation. The federal government is one of the leaders in automation. Do you think it is good for us as human beings to dehumanize work and sacrifice people, the machines, and money?
Well, I think it's all a question of degree and how it's done. Obviously, most of the comforts we now enjoy are the result of automation, technology over a period of 100, 150 years. And there was historically efforts at various times to stop the introduction of machines, which made the labor of men easier. So automation does not need to be, we hope, our enemy. Now, what is of concern now is the combination of a rather intensive period of automation, plus the fact that our educational system is not keeping up, so that we're graduating or dropping out of high school so many millions of young men and women who aren't able to operate in this new society, who have only physical labor to perform, and they can't find enough jobs. And so that's what concerns us. Now, as you know, we're retraining. Job retraining is important in that area, vocational training, trying to combat school dropouts, trying to urge families to keep their children in school, all the rest of these efforts with which you're familiar. We have a proposal before the Congress for a new analysis of automation. In answer to your question, I think machines can make life easier for men if men do not let the machines dominate them. And it's our intention to try to see that life is easier. The fact is, life is easier because of machines. And I think it can provide new jobs, but I think it's going to take a good deal of wisdom by those of us in the government as well as labor and management.
Mr. President, last week there was a certain amount of optimism that a sale of wheat would soon be reached for the Soviet Union. And a lot of this optimism seems to be gone last couple of days. I wonder, sir, if you could tell us quite precisely what seems to be holding up the sale and whether you are optimistic that the sale will be.
We're involved in negotiations, which are, of course, very intensive, and it seems to me this is the week where these negotiations are reaching a critical phase. I don't think that it would be useful for me to comment on them. I think we ought to know in the next days whether we're going to be successful in completing our sale. But obviously, this is a matter in which the seller and the buyer have interests which are not always harmonious, and we have to reach the best bargain possible. That's what they want, that's what we want. So I think we ought to let the negotiators negotiate.
Do you expect to use General David Jfk'S services in the government after he leaves?
I would hope so. I would hope so. If he will, I'd like to have him stay.
Mr. President, just shortly after the Bay of Pigs, I asked you how you liked being president. And as I remember, you said you liked it better before the event. Now you've had a chance to appraise your job. Why do you like it, and why do you want to stay in office 4 more years?
Well, I find the work rewarding. Whether I'm going to stay and what my intentions are and all the rest seems to me still a good many months away. But as far as the job of president goes, it's rewarding. And I've given before to this group the definition of happiness of the Greeks. I'll define it again with full use of your powers along lines of excellence. I find that, therefore, the president provides some happiness.
Yes. Mr. President, there have been persistent reports in recent days that the State Department is negotiating with the junta in the Dominican Republic, looking toward a resumption of full diplomatic relations. Are these reports true? Is there some basis on which we would be willing to recognize the present junta?
Well, there have been conversations in the Dominican Republic to see what assurances can be given regarding the restoration of democratic rule, constitutional rule in the Dominican Republic. We have a charge d'affaires there. Quite obviously, we're interested in that restoration, those assurances of free election. So we are continuing to carry out these discussions, though actually they're relatively informal and they have reaped no harvest as yet, but we're very much on the, that would be our policy, to attempt to see if we can resume relations with the Dominican Republic under assurances of a restoration of constitutional government.
President?
Yes.
Sir, when you...
As yet we've had no success.
Sir, when you approved the sale of wheat to the Soviet Union, you placed a condition on the sales that the shipments be in U.S. flagships to the extent that they were available. I wonder if you could explain to us how you came to place this condition on it, what the genesis of that condition was.
No, I think we ought to let the negotiators negotiate this week. Don't mean to be evasive, but I think we ought to let those who are representing the United States point of view, we ought to give them a free hand now. So I would rather not get into a discussion of the wheat deal. Next week, I'm sure we can.
Could you tell us how many troops there are in Cuba, or Russian troops there are in Cuba now, and what
No, I don't think we can ever give a precise figure. All I can say is that the numbers have steadily been reduced. And in the last 2 months, there have been further reductions. And since the 1st of January, there's been a marked decrease in the number of troops in Cuba, according to all our intelligence estimates. I couldn't give you a precise number that is still there, but I can give you the general trend is outward.
Mr. President, since you approved the wheat sale, other groups have come along and suggested we sell other products to the Russians too, surplus butter, for example. And Congressman Cooley says maybe if we send them some tobacco, it'll quiet their nerves a little bit. Would you favor expanding this list to other farm surpluses if they're interested?
They've shown no interest in anything else, but they may show interest if this deal is consummated, and I would be responsive to any further requests they made for farm commodities. But first we have to get this deal. I think this is the bellwether.
Mr. President, can you explain Secretary McNamara's rejection of the atomic power plant for the new carrier in the face of the experts like Admiral Rickover and Chairman Seaborg and others who think it's necessary? And will the same policy go over to the other warships the Navy wants of over 8,000 tons with the atomic energy?
No, we're going to build a conventional carrier, which has already been announced at this time. That's what we think that the Navy needs. Now, we're not going to make any final decision till a later date on whether we're going to have nuclear power for important ships of the Navy. As you suggest, there's no use having a nuclear carrier unless we have the ships that accompany it, and after all, there's a large train with a carrier, unless they have nuclear power, because so that it requires a rather large investment. In the case of the nuclear carrier, it's $60 or $70 million more. If you add up the other ships that might have to accompany it, it gets into a large sum of money. What is the mission of that carrier? What's it going to be used for? Limited war or strategic attack? What's the best use of that extra money? I think that I'm supporting Secretary McNamara in the decision he's made so far in this matter. Yes, Mr. Morgan? Yeah.
The United States Steel Corporation has rejected the idea that it should use economic pressure in effort to improve race relations in Birmingham, Alabama. Do you have any comment on that position, and do you have any counsel for management and labor in general as to their social responsibility in areas of tension of this kind?
Actually, Mr. Blau has been somewhat helpful in one or two cases that I can think of in Birmingham. I don't think he should narrowly interpret his responsibility for the future. That's a very influential company in Birmingham, and he wants to see that city prosper, as do we all. Obviously, the federal government cannot solve this matter, so that business has a responsibility, labor, and of course every citizen. So that I would think that particularly company which is as influential as United States Steel in Birmingham, I would hope would use its influence on the side of comedy between the races. Otherwise, the future Birmingham, of course, is not as happy as we would hope it would be. In other words, it can't be decided, this matter in Washington. It has to be decided by citizens everywhere. Mr. Blau is an influential citizen. I'm sure he'll do the best he can.
President,
Yes.
you've signed one executive order and one law banning conflicts of interest on the part of executive branch employees. In the light of recent events on Capitol Hill, do you think that that law should be broadened to cover members of Congress and congressional employees?
Well, I think they ought to wait till the investigation is over. It's only begun, and it's a matter which Congress, of course, would have to consider. But I think that perhaps out of the investigation there may come a decision to develop new rules, procedures, or laws, but I would rather wait till the Congress has had the hearing, then we can make a better judgment about that.
President?
Yes.
Do you think that Premier Khrushchev has actually taken the Soviet Union out of the so-called moon race? And in any case, do you think that the United States should proceed as if there were a moon race?
I didn't read that into his statements. I thought his statement was rather cautiously worded. I didn't get any assurances that Mr. Khrushchev of the Soviet Union was out of the space race at all. I think it's remarkable that some people who were so unwilling to accept our test ban treaty, where there was very adequate area of verification, whatever the Soviet Union was doing, were perfectly ready to accept Mr. Khrushchev's very guarded, careful, cautious remark that he was taking himself out of the space race and use that as an excuse for us to abandon our effort. The fact of the matter is the Soviets have made an intensive effort in space. There's every indication that they are continuing and that they have the potential to continue. And I would read Mr. Khrushchev's remarks very carefully. I think he said before anyone went to the moon there should be adequate preparation. We agree with that. In my opinion, the space program we have is essential to the security of the United States because, as I've said on many times before, it's not a question of going to the moon, it's a question of having the competence to master this environment. And I would not make any bets at all upon Soviet intentions. I think our experience has been that we wait for deeds unless we had a system of verification. We have no idea whether the Soviet Union is going to make a race for the moon or whether it's going to attempt an even greater program. I think we ought to stay with our program. I think that's the best answer to Mr. Khrushchev.
There still continue to be the fact that we have had no responses to your proposal for a joint moon exploration.
That's correct. That's correct. In addition, the two astronauts of the Soviet Union earlier that week had made a statement saying the Soviet Union was prepared to go on lunar expeditions. So I think that we shouldn't disregard our whole carefully worked out program, which is being carried on very impressively in Huntsville, Alabama, and in other places, merely because Mr. Khrushchev gave a rather Delphic interview to some correspondents. Yes, Mr. Gatley.
Mr. President, Fidel Castro claims to have captured some Americans whom he says are CIA agents, and he says he's going to execute them. Is there anything at all that you can tell us about this?
No.
What is the status of the bilateral air transport agreement between the United States and Russia?
It was initialed some months ago, more than a year ago, in fact a year and a half ago. There are still some technical matters which have to be discussed before it can be formally signed.
Are you optimistic of it being signed? And
I think there's a good chance it will be signed, yes.
Mr. President, as you know, the plan to build a national environmental health research center has been hung up in Congress. Apparently they can't decide where to build it. Now there's a report that you would like it built in North Carolina. Would you?
North Carolina would be very acceptable. I think the budget recommendation was Maryland, but North Carolina does have the facilities. But I think in our recommendation we made, HEW made, recommendation for the first recommendation was Maryland. The site in North Carolina is a good one, as there's a triangle there of colleges and hospitals and medical facilities that, and I've indicated that that would be satisfactory if that was the judgment of the Congress. I think our first choice was Maryland.
Mr. President, in spite of something you said here in May 1962, there's talk that Lyndon Johnson will be dumped next year. Senator Thruston Morton used the word purge. Now, sir, assuming that you run next year, would you want Lyndon Johnson on the ticket, and do you expect that he will be on the ticket?
Yes, to both of those questions. That's correct. Yes.
Mr. President, Navy Secretary Korth had some correspondence which indicated he worked very hard for the Continental National Bank of Fort Worth while he was in government, as well as for the Navy. And that during the same period of time that he negotiated, took part in a decision on a contract involving one of that bank's best customers, the General Dynamics firm. I wonder if this fulfills the requirements of your code of ethics in government, and if, in a general way, you think that it is within the law and proper.
In the case of the contract, the TFX contract, as you know, Mr. Molinoff, that matter was referred to the Department of Justice to see whether there was a conflict of interest, and the judgment was that there was not. That's number one. Number two, the amount of the loan to the company, that bank was one of a number of banks which participated in a line of credit, and it was relatively a small amount of money as bank loans go. So in answer to your question, I have no evidence that Mr. Korth acted in any way improperly in the TFX matter. It has nothing to do with any opinion that I may have about whether Mr. Korth might have written more letters and been busier than he should have been in one way or another. The fact of the matter is, I have no evidence that Mr. Korth benefited improperly during his term of office in the Navy, and I have no evidence, and you have not, as I understand it, the press has not produced any, nor the McClellan Committee, which would indicate that in any way he acted improperly in the TFX. And I always have believed that innuendos should be justified before they're made, either by me in the Congress or even in the press.
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr.
Senator
Hurlow?
Goldwater also said today that if he is nominated the Republican president, if he's the Republican presidential nominee, he'll gladly debate you. Would you accept this challenge?
Oh, I've indicated I was going to debate if I were renominated.
President, a number of your congressional leaders have said they favor the so-called quality stabilization bill, but all of your executive departments are opposed to it. Can you tell us what your views are on this legislation?
Well, that hasn't come to me as yet. I'm not. I've never been for the quality stabilization bill. I have to look at the bill when it finally comes in the form it's in. I quite obviously can't comment on the legislation before it finally comes to the desk of the White House, but the administration witnesses have spoken my views.
Mr. President, sir, would you please...
Unemployment is just about as high today as it was a year ago, but there are rumors that the administration has given up on getting Congress to extend the accelerated public works program. Is this a fact? And
No, the amount of money that's in the public works program runs through July, so that there's still a good deal of money that's available for public works under that program.
Does the act, sir, expire in January?
The amount of money, though, given the pipeline, runs through July, so this is not a matter for immediate decision before us.
President, sir, would you please tell us what is going to be the final decision on Mr. Otto Otepka, the security officer of the State Department who was up for firing? And would you please, a related question, tell us what was the final decision on whether the State Department employees can go before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee and answer questions?
Well, I don't think any final decision has been made on Mr. Otepka. I think there's a hearing scheduled in the next few days on the matter. And I said to you before that the Secretary of State would study the matter, and so would I, before any final decision is reached. And of course, if a decision is reached of the kind you described, it would be possible for him to appeal to the Civil Service Commission. Now, the question of, I have no objection. I think it would be perfectly appropriate for any employee of the federal government to appear before any congressional committee. I think it would be proper that the head of the department would be notified, but I'm sure that they'll give permission. Yeah.
A little while ago you said that our present force of combat troops would remain in Germany as long as they are required. I wondered whether you plan to be the sole determiner of that, or whether it would be a bilateral or a NATO-wide proposition.
Well, I would think it would be a NATO, it would certainly be discussed in NATO, and of course the country particularly affected, in this case the Federal Republic, its views would have very heavy weight.
President.
Very heavy weight.
In negotiating
I'm sure that no action would be taken which would not meet the needs of the country involved, Federal Republic as well as our own. Yeah.
Mr. President, in negotiating the limited nuclear test ban treaty, we and the Russians avoided the issue of international inspection by limiting it to the 3 environments in which that theoretically was not required. Now we have joined at the UN in proposing a wider ban, including underground tests. Is there anything new in the state of the art of detection or in our understanding of the Soviet position that leads us to hope we can get anywhere with this approach?
I'm doubtful that we can get any place. We're still insisting on inspection. The Soviet Union is still resisting inspection, and therefore, unless the art of seismology improves, I would think we would not get an agreement. Sometime it may improve, so it's not necessary for us to have the kind of detailed inspection that we believe necessary, or perhaps the Soviet Union would change its policy. I would hope either event would occur. For the present, I'm not optimistic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
President Kennedy held his last news conference. If I recollect correctly, this was a conference that was held in the morning in response to requests by afternoon papers. You know, even some of the conservative newspapers that criticized the president for managing the news were among those who asked that they be given a shot at a presidential news conference. In other words, they didn't confuse their political beliefs with the power of a presidential headline, whether it be President Kennedy or President Eisenhower or who. And so the president held a morning news conference. I believe it was this one. And it occurred to us that at this time you would like to hear the President of the United States on his last meeting with the reporters, his last direct and informal contact with the people of this country through the newsmen who cover Washington on radio, television, and for the press. It so happened that on that day, NBC's Robert Goralski introduced the late president at his last news conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Morning, gentlemen. Ladies. Come here. Yes. How menacing do you regard the Cambodian threat to reject our foreign aid? Can that country be slipping into the communist orbit? Well, I regard it as serious. It's my hope that Prince Sihanouk, who must be concerned about the independence and the sovereignty of his country, he has, after all, been involved for many years in maintaining that independence, will not decide at this dangerous point in the world's affairs to surrender it. I would think that he's more concerned about Cambodian independence than we are. After all, he's a Cambodian, so that my judgment is that in the long run that he will protect that independence. It would be folly not to, and I don't think he's a foolish man.
Mr. President, how do you regard the case involving Professor Barkhorn, and what are we doing about getting his release from the Russian government?
You know, the American ambassador, the United States Embassy, has made 6 protests to the Soviet government in the last 48 hours. Ambassador Kohler has been to the Soviet Foreign Ministry personally. The United States government is deeply concerned about the unwarranted and unjustified arrest of Professor Barkhorn by the fact that he was held for a number of days without the United States being informed of it, and that the United States officials in the Soviet Union have not had an opportunity to visit with him. He was not on an intelligence mission of any kind. He's a distinguished professor of Soviet affairs. He's played a most helpful and constructive role in arranging cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges. We're concerned not only for his personal safety, but because this incident, I think, can have a most serious effect upon what we understood the Soviet government's strong hope, and was certainly our hope, we would find a widening of cultural, intellectual exchanges. We've heard from a good many universities and private organizations which have expressed their alarm, who've been taking part in these exchanges, and it's quite clear that the professor's early release is essential if these programs are to be continued. I can assure you that the Department of State Our embassy in Moscow will do everything it can to effect the early release of the professor. His arrest is unjustified. I repeat again, he was not on an intelligence mission of any kind. I'm hopeful that this will become quickly obvious to the Soviet Union and that they will release him.
President.
Yes, Mr. Callan.
Some persons view Professor Barkhorn's arrest as a sign the Soviets are now deliberately seizing innocent Americans with the aim of later swapping them for some of their convicted espionage agents, or that the Soviets may be doing this with the hope of somehow extracting political concessions from us. How would you view any such tactics?
Well, I wouldn't think, obviously they would not be successful. I wouldn't attempt to make a judgment as to the conduct of the Soviet Union or what may motivate it from week to week, day to day. But I'm certainly, it's quite obvious that if it's based on the presumptions you state, that it will not be successful.
Mr. President?
Yes?
What are the prerequisites or conditions for resumption of some form of trade with Red China?
We're not planning to trade with Red China in view of the policy that Red China pursues. When if the Red Chinese indicate a desire to live at peace with the United States, with other countries surrounding it, then quite obviously the United States would reappraise its policies. We don't wedded to a policy of hostility to Red China. It seems to me Red China's policies are what create the tension between not only the United States and Red China, but between Red China and India, between Red China and our immediate neighbors to the south, and even between Red China and other communist countries. Yes.
The President, now seems unlikely that you will get either your tax bill or your civil rights bill in this session of Congress. Does that disturb you?
Oh, I think that the longer they're delayed, I think that, I think it's, yes, I think it is unfortunate. The fact of the matter is that both these bills should be passed. The tax bill has been before the Congress for nearly a year. Civil rights has been there for a much shorter time. It didn't go up till June. And I'm hopeful that the House will certainly act on that in the next month, maybe sooner. The tax bill, the hearings have been quite voluminous. It seemed to me that it might be possible to end those hearings and bring the matter to the floor of the Senate before the end of the year. Otherwise, the civil rights bill will come over after the first of the year. There may be a very long debate. The tax bill may be caught up in that. I suppose some people are hopeful that that's so, but I'm not. And I think that the economy will suffer. The economy will suffer, and I think that I certainly would not want to be responsible for that. Therefore, we'd like to get the tax bill out of the way quickly and this important piece of legislation. I would think the members of Congress would.
Mr. President, there have been published reports that General Harkins may have lost his usefulness in Vietnam because of his identification with the Diem regime and lack of contacts with the new generals running the country. Would you care to comment on that?
I think it's wholly untrue. I have complete confidence in him. He was just doing his job. I think he said in the interview yesterday he had seen Mr. New, I think, only 3 times. He'd seen President Zim on a number of occasions. That was his job. That was what he was sent for, to work with the government in power. That's what he will do with the new government. I have great confidence in General Harkins. And there may be some who would like to see General Harkins go, but I plan to keep him there.
Mr. President?
Yes.
Following up that, sir, would you give us your appraisal of the situation in South Vietnam now since the coup and the purposes for the Honolulu conference?
Well, because we do have a new situation and a new government. We hope a increased effort in the war. The purpose of the meeting in Honolulu, which Ambassador Lodge will be there, General Harkins will be there, others, with Secretary McNamara and others, and then, as you know, later Ambassador Lodge will come here, is to attempt to assess the situation, what American policy should be, what our aid policy should be, how we can intensify the struggle, how we can bring Americans out of there. Now, that is our object, to bring Americans home, to permit the South Vietnamese to maintain themselves as a free and independent country, and permit the democratic forces within the country to operate, which they can, of course, much more freely when the assault from the inside, and which is manipulated from the north, is ended. So the purpose of the meeting in Honolulu is how to pursue these objectives. Yeah.
Mr. President, Madam New has now left the United States, but indicated that she intends to return.
will we renew her tourist visa?
Yes.
And if she asks for it, will we grant her permanent residence, perhaps as a political
Well, I think we
refuge?
waited, but it would certainly permit her to return to the United States if she wishes to do so. Yeah.
Year by year, the foreign aid program seems to encounter more and more resistance in the Congress, and this year we're seeing senators who ordinarily in the past have gone along with the program.
Yes, this is the worst attack on foreign aid that we've seen since the beginning of the Marshall Plan.
In the event that one of these years the Congress, the arguments for foreign aid notwithstanding, surprises itself by voting the program out, what would we then do?
I think it would be a great mistake. I think, of course, some of the difficulty is where the President sits and where the members of the Senate sit. It's been said very many times, and I've never questioned it, that the Senate and the Congress have every right to decide how much money should be appropriated. That's their constitutional right. But on the other hand, the President bears particular responsibilities in the field of foreign policy. If there are failures in the Middle East, Africa and Latin America, South Vietnam, Laos, it's usually not a senator who is selected to bear the blame, but it's the administration, the President of the United States. I regard this, President Eisenhower regarded President Truman. It's no coincidence that all three presidents, since this program began, and presidential candidates, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Stevenson, Governor Dewey, that all of them, Governor Rockefeller today, others, seems to me all recognize the importance of this program. It's because it's a very valuable arm of the United States in the field of foreign policy. I don't think it's recognized what an important influence this has. Now, we spend $51 to $2 billion on defense. We spend $2.5 billion on the atomic energy program. We spend $5 billion on space, of which at least a good percentage has a military implication in the sense of our national security. We spend all this money, and yet we're going to deny the President of the United States a very valuable weapon in maintaining the influence of the United States in this very diversified world. I can't imagine anything more dangerous than to end this program. I can assure you that whoever is President of the United States succeeding me will support this program. Now, the second point I want to make is that what we are now talking about is only a fourth of what we tried to do in the early 50s. When I said in the, I don't understand why we are suddenly so fatigued. I don't regard the struggle as over, and I don't think it's probably going to be over for this century. I think this is a continuing effort, and it's not a very heavy one. It's a fraction of our budget, a fraction of our gross national product. The gross national product of the United States has increased $100 billion. We'll have by the end of this year in a 3-year period. So what we're asking is $1 billion less than in the average program since '47. The need today is greater. These countries are poorer. There's a good many more of them. And yet we're being denied. The President of the United States is being threatened with denying him a very important weapon in helping him meet his responsibility. The Congress has its responsibilities, but in the field of foreign policies, there are particular burdens placed on the President, whoever he may be. The Supreme Court in the Curtis Right has said that the President is the organ of the country in the field of foreign policy. I just want to say, personally as President, and my predecessor said the same, this program is essential to the conduct of our foreign policy. And therefore, I'm asking the Congress of the United States to give me the means of conducting the foreign policy of the United States. And if they do not want to do so, then they should recognize that they're severely limiting my ability to protect the interests of the country. That's how important I think this program is.
President, before you leave the subject, sir, would you comment just a bit further? It is still a fact that a negative action by Congress is something that an administration has great difficulty in coping with. Has the administration, has the government looked ahead to that possibility and prepared against it?
No, I can't believe that the Congress of the United States is going to be so unwise unless we're going to retreat from the world. We're going to give up in South Vietnam. We're going to give up in Latin America. I've said before that what we're talking about in the case of Latin America, the Alliance for Progress, for all of Latin America is what the Soviet Union and the bloc are putting into Cuba alone. Now, can you tell me the United States isn't able to do that? In addition, these amendments, which are passed because they don't like a particular leader or a particular national policy, as of the moment, it's a very changing world. Because they don't like the fishing policy, we're going to decide that end all aid to 2 or 3 countries in Latin America that are hard-pressed, rather than permitting us to negotiate the matter out. But anyway, as I say, they have their responsibilities and I have mine. I've just tried to make it very clear that I cannot fulfill my responsibility in the field of foreign policy without this program. Now, the most important program, of course, is our national security. But I don't want the United States have to put troops there. What's going to happen in Laos if it collapses? They're going to blame the Senate, or they're going to blame me? I know who they're going to blame. So I need this program. Yeah.
As a possible candidate for president, would you comment on the possible candidacy of Margaret Chase Smith and specifically what effect that would have on the New Hampshire primary?
I would think, if I were a Republican candidate, I would not look forward to campaigning against Margaret Chase Smith in New Hampshire. Or as a possible candidate for president, I think she's very formidable, if that's the appropriate word to use about a very fine lady. She's a very formidable political figure.
Mr. President, getting back to Professor Barghorn for a moment, the negotiations for a renewal of the exchange agreement with the Soviet Union was scheduled to begin next Tuesday, and now, as I understand it, have been postponed.
Right.
Do those negotiations depend upon the release of Professor Barghorn?
I don't think it's helpful for the professor to try to put these conditions upon it. I just say that there's no sense having a program if a man who is innocent of any intelligence mission, which is true in this case, is subjected to arrest without means of defense. How can you carry on that kind of a program? I'm sure that everybody would agree that it would be hopeless under these conditions.
Mr. President, would you comment on the wheat deal with the Soviet Union and tell us whether the Export-Import Bank or whether any other agency of government is doing more in this deal than it would for any friendly country?
No, it will not do more than it would for any friendly country. The matter is now in private negotiation, and I don't know what's going to happen on the deal. Yes, Mr. Smith.
Would you expand, sir, on the changes in the travel restrictions for Soviet diplomats? For example, in Oregon, there were 5 counties that were off limits during the past 2 years, and now it's been expanded to 13 counties. Could you expand?
Well, in the case of the Soviet Union, 26% of their country are off limits to the United States, and we have put the same percentage of ours. If they would be willing to change that percentage and drop it, I think we would be willing to. Now, in the case of the bloc, we've attempted to put some limitations upon the travel of bloc military attachés because we feel that it's important to the security of the United States and to the alliance. The base of the alliance rests upon the nuclear forces of the United States. I think we have to protect their security. And the Defense Department felt very strongly that this was important to the security of the United States, or otherwise it would not have been done. Yes, Mr. Knight.
I think a few minutes ago you said it would be unfortunate if the tax bill and the civil rights bill don't get through. You just said also it's the worst attack on the foreign aid bill since its inception. Several appropriations bills are still hung up in Congress, the first time in history this late. What's happened on Capitol?
Well, they're all interrelated. I think that there's some delay because of civil rights. That's had an effect upon the passage of appropriation bills. There isn't any question. On the other hand, of course, what we're talking about in both the civil rights bill and the tax bill are very complicated and important pieces of legislation. In fact, more significant in their own way than legislation which has been sent up there for a decade. My judgment is that by the time this Congress goes home, in the sense of next summer, that in the fields of education, mental health, taxes, civil rights, this is going to be a record that's going to be, however dark looks now, I think that westward look the land is bright, and I think by next summer it may be. Yes. Mr. Van Oken, we don't hear very much.
Mr. President,
yes.
In view of what you just said, sir, you listed certain items. You didn't mention medical care for the aged.
Yes.
Now, even though Chairman Mills has promised to hold hearings this month, there doesn't seem to be any immediate prospect of clearing it. Since he was so helpful on the tax bill, are you prepared to ask him to cast his vote to get that out of committee so the House can vote on it?
I think that we're going to get that bill out of committee, not this year, but next year, and I think we'll have a vote on it, and I think it will pass. But I don't think it will pass this year. I think it will next year. I think that's one of the, I didn't mean to make an exclusive list. I'm looking forward to the record of this Congress, but it may not come till, this is going to be an 18-month delivery.
Mr. Mr. President, the program put forward by this distinguished committee of private citizens, it seems to go farther than your bill on Medicare. Would you be prepared to sponsor a program, say, if Senator Javits joined with Senator Anderson in a bipartisan measure?
Yes, I'm going to meet with them, and I think that that bill recognized the principle of Social Security. I thought it was a very valuable job because it was a bipartisan. The committee was distinguished Republicans on it as well as Democrats. I'm meeting with Senator Anderson and Senator Javits, and I think that this offers us a good deal of hope for that bill. I think they've given it new life. Mr. Kenworthy?
Part of the disenchantment on Capitol Hill over foreign aid seems to stem from the feeling that the administration hasn't fully used the flexibility it asks. For example, on aid to Indonesia when President Sukarno is threatened Malaysia, or on...
well, now, Mr. Kenworthy, we've suspended the aid to Indonesia.
But haven't suspended, have you, Mr. President, to United Arab Republic, which is defying the UN? And,
well, now, in the case of Indonesia, though, we are suspending it. It seems to me it's much better. I don't know what the situation is going to be 3 months from now in regard to relations between Indonesia and Malaysia. I hope they are better. What is the possible use of passing a prohibition against assistance to Indonesia because of its attitude towards Malaysia when 3 months from now it may or may not be the same as it is today? That's the point. Now, in the United Arab Republic, the United States, as you know, 80% of its assistance consists of food, surplus food. We have been working to try to get a withdrawal, an orderly withdrawal in the case of the Yemen. There has not been a conflict, I think a good deal as a result of effort which we and others have made between Saudi Arabia and the UAR. I am concerned about the Yemen because the rate of the withdrawal, of course, has been quite limited. There are going to be further withdrawals by January, but unless those withdrawals are consistent with earlier statements, I would think that the chance of increased tension between the UAR and Saudi Arabia would substantially increase. But I don't think, Mr. Kenworthy, that the language that the Senate adopted, which calls upon me to make a finding which is extremely complicated to make, is particularly strengthens our hands or our flexibility in dealing with the UAR. In fact, it will have the opposite result. These countries are poor. I'm not now talking about the UAR, most of them. These threats from the United States, they're going to cut off all aid. There's a great temptation if I were in the country to say, cut it off. I mean, they're nationalists, they're proud, they're in many cases radical. I don't think threats from Capitol Hill bring the result which are frequently hoped. Quiet work may not bring it, but I think there's a great temptation to say that at the time when the Aswan Dam was cut off, that didn't bring the Arab Republic to follow us, produced the opposite result. I'm afraid these other threats, I think it's a very dangerous, untidy world, but we're going to have to live with it. And I think one of the ways to live with it is permit us to function. And if we don't function, the voters will throw us out, but not to make it impossible for us to function by legislative restraints or inadequate appropriations.
Mr. President, in view of congressional sentiment toward the Alliance for Progress program, is your administration going to make any special effort to persuade the government of Argentina not to nationalize American-owned oil companies?
Well, as you know, Governor Harriman visited the Argentine, discussed the matter. It's now in negotiation. What we're concerned about is if action is taken, that there be adequate machinery for compensation, fair compensation. We can't deny the sovereign right of a country to take action within its borders, but we can insist that there be equitable standards for compensating those whose property are taken away from them. We are attempting to work this out with the Argentine. But the Argentine is faced, as all of Latin America, with staggering problems. They've emerged from a military hunter, Peronism, and all the rest, democratic election, and this was one of the commitments that were made. So now we attempt to adjust our interests. But we are concerned about the oil, in Argentina and in Peru. Yes, excuse me, Mr. Mayor.
You were quoted saying you were very satisfied with the vote in Philadelphia. Why were you satisfied?
Because Mayor Tate was elected. As John Bailey said, the Republicans had the statistics and we the opposite, so that's why I'm satisfied. Yeah.
The Fred Korth and Bobby Baker cases have prompted some serious questions about the moral and ethical climate in Washington. What is your assessment of today's climate in Washington?
Well, I think it's always First of all, I don't lump the two cases together. I think there are differences between the two cases. I want to make that. I want to make that clear. So there are differences between the cases. Now, if you're talking about, they're always bound to be in the government, newspaper business, labor, and so on, farmers. There are always going to be people who can't stand the pressure of opportunity. So that what the important point is, what action is taken against them. And I think that this administration has been very vigorous in its action, and I think that we tried to set responsible standards. There's always going to be people that fail to meet that standard, and then we attempt to take appropriate action dealing with each case. But Mr. Baker is now being investigated, and I think we know a good deal more about Mr. Baker before we're through. Other people may be investigated as time goes on. We just try to do the best we can. And I think that the governmental standards, let me say, on the whole, I think compare favorably with those in Washington, with those some other parts of America. Yes.
Last week, Mr. President, the Soviet Union in Moscow showed what they claimed was an anti-missile missile. I wonder if you could tell us what you know about that missile. Is it what they claim it is supposed to be? And also, what is the effectiveness of their anti-missile system?
Well, I don't think it's probably useful to discuss it in detail here. I don't think there's any doubt that they have an anti-missile missile, as do we. The problem, of course, however, is what you deal with saturation. And I don't think that the Soviet Union or the United States have solved the problem of dealing, as I've said before, with a whole arsenal of missiles coming at us at maximum speed with decoys. That's the impossible. That, up till now, has been the impossible task.
Mr. President, we seem to be in somewhat of a stalemate on recognizing the new regimes in two Latin American countries, the Dominican Republic and Honduras. I'm wondering, the administration perhaps has been reluctant to tell these countries precisely what they had to do to get recognition.
No, we've had discussions with both countries. As you know, this is not just a matter of the United States. This is a matter of nearly the whole hemisphere. In fact, by a vote of 18-1, the OAS voted to have a meeting on the problem of military coups. We've attempted to indicate or inquire what steps each of these two countries, the governments of the two countries, are prepared to take to return to constitutional government, which we regard as the most desirable form of government and also the one that would be most effective in meeting the challenges of the hemisphere. So we've inquired of both of them what steps they're prepared to take, when elections would be, who would be in the government. So we've been working very assiduously.
General terms, sir, could you say whether we would be prepared to accept the same conditions for recognition there that we did in the case of the junta in Peru? Elections within 1 year, for example?
Well, I think it'd be unwise to attempt to negotiate it out here, but we did recognize the junta in Peru on the assurances that they would hold elections. They did hold them, and the result was very fair, so that it shows that it can be done. That's what we'd like to see done in these countries. Yes,
Mr. President, to go back to the Russian-American problem, given the fact that our relations seem to alternate between hot and cold, the Barkhorn case and the Audubon at the moment, what do you say to those Americans who say that in such a situation we should not sell wheat to the Soviet Union, or certainly not without trying to use it as a method of, say, negotiating some better arrangement on the Audubon?
Well, I think the wheat deal is desirable for us, desirable for the Soviet Union. I'm not convinced it may mean $200 million in balance of payments for us. It means wheat to the Soviet Union. But in view of the supplies that the Soviet Union have in its own country, in Australia, and Canada, I'm not sure that the wheat can carry other loads. I think it pretty much stands on its own. It's of some benefit to us, some benefit to the Soviet Union, but this idea that other things can be hitched onto it. But we are, quite obviously, this kind of trade that depends upon a reasonable atmosphere in both countries. I think that atmosphere has been badly damaged by the Barkhorn arrest. In the case of the Audubon, this is a continuing matter over a good many years. We're going to maintain our rights in Berlin, and we've made that quite clear. I expect that we're going to have difficulties, and the Soviet Union may have difficulties in other matters. But Professor Barghorn, I regard as a very serious matter.
President,
yes, Mr. Raymond,
do you feel that you have a firm commitment from the Republicans in the House leadership to back and support in the Rules Committee and on the floor every provision in the compromise bill approved by the House?
I wouldn't want to speak for them. I think they ought to speak for themselves. I will say that a substantial part of that bill bears Republican language and imprint. Wouldn't have been passed without their support. It is a bill which is Republican and Democratic. I think it's a bill which is bipartisan. I would hope it would have it can't pass without bipartisan support. I would hope it would be able to maintain it on the floor of the House, because if we don't, we're not even going to get it through the House. Yes, Mr. Raymond.
In view of the changed situation in South Vietnam, do you still expect to bring back 1,000 troops before the end of the year, or has that figure been raised or lowered?
No, we're going to bring back several hundred before the end of the year. But I think on the question of the exact number, I thought we'd wait till the meeting of November 20th.
Yes. Mr. President, we seem to be getting some distressing news from Sao Paulo in Brazil in relation to the Alliance for Progress. Now, the Post had some piece this morning saying that this idea has been circulated by which the alliance would be made worldwide with the participation of Eastern European countries and the Soviet Union, and this to help the alliance reach its goals. Can you tell us in principle what do you think about it?
No, I've never heard of that, and we're not proposing to engage in a joint effort with the Eastern Europeans. There may be, that's a matter, of course, of sovereign decision, but I don't regard them as interested at all in the alliance, because the alliance, the Charter of Punta del Este, is based upon the development of free democratic societies in Latin America, which is our objective. Their objective is, of course, different. So I don't see how you can join them in the alliance. Yes.
Several months ago, you nominated David Rabinovich to be a federal judge in western Wisconsin. Since that time, the American Bar Association has opposed this nomination, and the majority of lawyers polled by the State Bar Association said that he was unqualified. Do you still support this nomination, or in view of this opposition, are you going to withdraw?
No, I'm for David Rabinowitz all the way. I know him very well. In fact, for a number of years, and the American Bar Association has been very helpful in making the judgment, but I'm sure they would agree that they are not infallible. Mr. Brandeis was very much opposed. There have been many judges who have been opposed, have been rather distinguished, and I'm for David Rabinowitz. Yes.
Sir, do you mean to leave the implication by your remarks on the wheat thing that if the Barghorn case is not satisfactory?
No, I wouldn't attempt to. I want to get Professor Barghorn out of prison, and it seems to me the best way to do it is to confine my remarks to what I've said. I'm merely saying, in fact, I won't even say it anymore.
President, the senators from New England met this morning in the office of Senator Kennedy and agreed to renew their annual appeal for relief on wool and for the lifting of restrictions on residual oil. What can you do and what will you do to help the people in New England on these problems?
As I understand it, in one case there's a desire to limit imports, and the other is to encourage imports. So that we're, I used to take part in those meetings myself. On the other hand, and there is a matter of concern. As a matter of fact, yesterday I met with the head of the coal producers, Coal Association, very concerned about the imports of residual oil. And but it is a fact that the imports of woolens and worsteds have gone up from about 15 to 22 or 3%. So there has been a sharp increase, and it is a matter of concern. In the case of residual, we are attempting to, that's a matter of great interest, as you know, to Venezuela, which is a country that's under communist attack, and therefore we have to consider that obligation as well as our obligations to the domestic coal industry. So we have not forgotten New England.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you.
And that was the last press conference, the last news conference that John F. Kennedy ever had. It took place last Thursday morning.